on Homelessness, Jennifer Friedenbach. It's all right. Happy Friday.
Thank you. Happy Friday to you too.
I was just telling Jennifer this in the little corner over there, but my original plan, like I said, was to have me moderating a debate. That's not going to happen tonight, but what I'm going to try to do is channel someone who might have suspicions or questions or doubts about maybe your perspective on the issue, what you think is the right solution to this issue. But I think you know this, I've said it before, but Manny's and Manny doesn't have a perspective, right? So I'm just going to say what I think people might, the kind of what a contradictory question might look like, but it doesn't actually represent what I believe, right? It doesn't matter what I believe. That's not what I'm trying to do here. Just trying to see if we can have a good back and forth. So tonight's subject is what should be done to address homelessness. And I think in San Francisco, I think the subtext in that question is it isn't already being done. So I guess I'll just start with that very broad question. Like if you were in charge of all of the tools that were at your disposal currently to address homelessness in San Francisco, what would you do to solve the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think, hi, good evening, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer. Could you start first with giving a little context of the coalition and what you do?
Yeah, and I was going to do that anyway.
I'm sure you were. Sorry.
So happy to. So I'm the director of the Coalition on Homelessness, and for folks who aren't familiar with the organization, basically what we do is we organize homeless people and frontline service providers to create permanent solutions to homelessness. And we also fight to protect the human rights of folks who are forced to remain on the streets. And how we do that is we do a lot of outreach to unhoused folks and get their input on what they'd like to see happen and what solutions there are. We really try to elevate their voices. And then we, do campaigns and do whatever it takes to kind of fight for that. So we do things like write legislation or do even go to the ballot. We do lawsuits, we do protests, we do public education, we basically just, whatever, we really use from a community organizing perspective, if people are familiar with it, we use a variety of tactics to try to achieve social change. And we believe that solutions need to come from people who are impacted by the issue. And so that's really where we try to center our work. And so we're probably most known for a couple things. First of all, for the Street Sheet, which is our newspaper, which is written primarily by folks with lived experience with homelessness. It has poetry, journalism, et cetera.
Has anyone purchased the Street Sheet, or folks know what Jennifer's talking about? Awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
So it's people get to keep 100% of those proceeds and serves as a public education tool and really, people being able to express themselves, unfiltered from their perspective. So, and then the other thing we're probably pretty well known for is Prop C, Our City, Our Home, which was a 2018 kind of classic tax the rich, house the poor. It's a 0.5% tax on corporate income starting at 50 million, 50, and it's an average of 0.5%, and it generates $300 million a year, which basically doubled our homeless budget and was held up in court and is very slowly rolling out, and we'll talk more about that, but is going to be about 4,000 more housing units, 1,000 more shelter beds, about 7,000 households prevented from being homeless, and service for thousands of folks in terms of behavioral health treatment. So far, it's added about 250 beds to our behavioral health treatment system, but it's in process. And so, but those are two of the things that we're well known for. And as an example on Prop C, that was really came from unhoused people, from their ideas, and we did a whole bunch of work, spent about a year researching and pulling it together, and in the end, we're able to hire about 350 unhoused people who did calls to 90,000 voters and knocked on about 30,000 doors. And so it was just like a huge effort that turned out to be really successful. So that's the coalition. Back to your question, what could we do?
Yeah, what should be done?
Yeah. So I think we are in a situation where we're a municipality and homelessness is a national problem and a state problem, um, and is really driven by rising rents, changes in the economy, the affordability levels of housing, and was really create. We've had two waves of mass homelessness in the United States, one after the Great Depression, um, and then that was solved through policy. So now we're in a situation where the second wave of homelessness that occurred starting in the early 1980s has been decades and decades long, right? And so that really wasn't solved like the Great Depression because we didn't have those investments in housing. So I'm just contextualizing this that it is a city, so how much can San Francisco do? We do have some benefits because we're a very affluent city. We have a better tax base than, say, Oakland or some of the other areas, and there's certainly a lot that we can do. So, first off, we really need to prioritize the issue in a real way. We have it seems like a lot of money that we're spending, $600 million now. The overwhelming majority of that is going to housing, as it should. Some of that housing that has been in place for decades, and it's just for the operating. That that investment, though, in if you put it in context of a $14 billion budget in San Francisco, is not that much. And if we're going to solve homelessness, we've got to invest. It costs money. It just does. And are there things that we can do differently in our system? Absolutely. We have an access issue in San Francisco around housing that's overly complicated and very difficult. And so one of the things that I would do is I would really make sure that folks who are in community-based organizations have placement authority in when they real time. So if there's a housing unit available today, that person can put them in the housing and we do the paperwork after they're in housing. It is an absolutely crazy process that we put impoverished people through in order to get services. And that's pretty much all services, but housing is especially difficult. The other thing that I would do is I would reorganize our street approach to be person focused. And what we have now is complaint focused. So it's all about clearing complaints. So people have a homeless person, they call 911 or 311. They generally they have the police come out. It's very expensive. It's not effective. Police can't solve homelessness. They cost $250,000 each. Or we have these new street teams and they kind of drop in and come out, or we do the encampment removals where we drop in, and it's a lot of force, a lot of distrust, and a lot of money spent moving people from block to block to block, but not getting them off the street and into housing. And we actually exacerbate homelessness with these efforts because the people who do have longer term relationships with outreach workers lose those relationships. Their credit gets destroyed because they get criminalized, ticketed, et cetera, et cetera. So it exacerbates homelessness. So investments, and it would be increasing our investments specifically in things that are tangible to unhoused people. So beds, right? Beds, whether it's in treatment programs, housing, safe, decent housing, shelter beds, all those places, but places to actually go. Those are the hard, tangible services, and we need a massive investment in that. Easy access, and really changing our street response so that we're working, and it's broken down by individuals and geographic, so we're really spending time with the people. A lot of times it'll take weeks and weeks. You got to work intensively to get them off the streets. It's not a jump in and jump out type situation. So those would be my three things. Sorry, I know you're kind of, I'm probably going on too long.
Well, no, but what's exciting about, not exciting, I guess, I feel somewhat validated now in this series because you're talking about all this stuff and it's like yesterday we heard about the street crisis response team and what those vans actually do. You talked about Prop C, and we learned all about Prop C yesterday. We learned, of course, on day 2 about the 80s and what happened in the 80s with Ronald Reagan and the vouchers and HUD being cut. So I'm listening to you, and I'm also being reminded of all the things that we've learned over this week so that we can be better informed as to the issue. The first thing is about shelter versus housing. And we've talked about this question. If you have a limited amount of money and you have to decide where to portion that money because our money is limited, there seems to be some debate over what proportion of that should go towards temporary shelter beds that are not permanent supportive housing, and what percentage should go to permanent supportive housing. Last night we heard the 1-2-4 kind of framework, but when you and I first talked about this, you said, people think that I'm anti-shelter, but I'm not anti-shelter. It's just permanent supportive housing is a much better solution, is an actual solution. So tell me why the city should not, why you believe the city should not massively invest in shelter beds just to get folks off the street versus permanent supportive housing, which takes a lot longer to build, but is a better solution.
Yeah, so we have an amount of money. What you want to do ideally is that you want to put the right amount, it's called right sizing, in each one. And it's actually science-based. And, it's a modeling thing that they do, and you figure it out. And you do these thought experiments and run these numbers. And if you put all your money into shelter and you're not preventing new people from becoming homeless, and then people aren't moving out of shelter, you have a drop in the number of people on the streets the first year, but the second year you see an increase in the number of people on the streets. Between our last 2 pit counts, for example, for every 1 person we housed, we had 4 more people becoming homeless, right? So we're doing a terrible job at prevention, which I should have mentioned in the first part. So the prevention piece is really important. So is the flow through the system, because shelters are expensive. We always say, oh, housing's so expensive. Actually, it's more expensive to shelter people. Sorry, hate to break it to you.
Why is it more expensive to shelter someone than it is to house them?
So if you're running a shelter, you typically have round the clock staffing. So let's say it's in a congregate space. So you have 3 shifts that you're having to cover there. If you're opening up a shelter, you have to bring in the showers and the bathrooms and all that kind of stuff. So even if you do it in what you think of as a low cost thing, like a tent city or something like that, like a little tent village, you have to level, you have to, there's all the stuff that's up front, but then there's the staffing costs that are a lot more intensive. And it also isn't faster. And so a lot of people think that, well, when we do acquisition, so we did one of the cool things that kind of came, one of the cool things, it sounds so weird saying that, pandemic was a nightmare. Silver lining is that we had tourist hotels that were suddenly available, right? And so we've been able to do these acquisitions. There was actually a couple buildings that was acquired with Prop C money that were going to be like tech worker housing, and then there's been like some student housing, some youth hostels, all these different things. You can acquire those much quicker than you can set up a shelter. And there's doors that lock, et cetera, so you don't need the same level of staffing. And so it's faster, it's often, and then there's, so even with the creation of new units, so acquisitions, you're buying a building, you get people in quick, even if you're spending a bunch of money, if you put it out on a spreadsheet over years and owning the building, the operating costs are so much lower, you end up saving money there. So it's not faster, it's not cheaper. Okay, so what you want, and what I was, you're still homeless.
Just to ask a clarifying question on that. One of the folks that spoke actually said that it was a great mistake for the city to buy all these properties because now there's no money for leasing, and that there was such an upfront cost. Do you guys remember that? There was such an upfront cost in buying all these buildings that now there isn't money to do these longer term leases because all the money was spent into purchasing these places, and so there's not a dollar left to purchase a new unit. This is what was told to us. Is that true?
No, because all the purchases happened because of Prop C generates $300 million a year. That's ongoing. And then with the lawsuit, Prop C, those funds were held up in court. They couldn't be released, but they were being collected into the fund. So we had $600 million in a fund, but you really can only use those as one time. So it doesn't create an opportunity to do leasing into the future because it's not an ongoing revenue source. It's a one-time revenue source because it was from those first 2 years. So naturally, you're then going to want to use those for one-time costs. So
Oh, so you couldn't use those for leases, that money?
well, you could, but you'd run out, you'd only have lease for a couple years or 5 years or, whatever it broke out to. And then after the 5 years, you wouldn't have the income source to continue those leases. And so, the smart thing to do is to use it for acquisitions. So then you're driving down your costs and then you don't have the leasing costs, you just have the operating costs. So maintenance and you don't have the loan cost, all of that stuff. So you have the staffing costs ongoing, but that's the way to do it. The only other thing we could do with one-time funds besides acquisitions really is you can do short-term rental subsidies. So these are subsidies where, they're called rapid rehousing, where you put someone in housing for a couple years and then they take over the rent on their own. Very difficult to do for extremely impoverished people with our rent prices. It works pretty well in other areas where there's cheaper rents. And let's say it's a woman fleeing domestic violence. She gets a job. She's able to, in a working class job, afford rent on her own. Pretty difficult to do in the Bay Area. So the short-term rental subsidies, and then aside from that, like that's pretty much your choices.
So before we get into, how to address street homelessness, I initially was going to start with the premise that we can all agree that permanent supportive housing is the best solution. But as I've sat here and listened to folks, and I've actually did research for this conversation, there also seems to be an ongoing debate over whether or not that's the case. And the reason for that is when I heard Director McSpadden talk about how a majority of the $600 million that is in the budget is going towards the 15,000 folks who are currently in permanent supportive housing. If we keep building permanent supportive housing for thousands and thousands of people, that's going to start costing billions of dollars a year just to keep folks in the housing we're building for them. So my question is like, where does it end? I mean, we could house another 10,000 people, but now we need $1.5 billion a year so that all those folks don't go back into street homelessness. So I guess the question for you is like, at what point do we say we have reached the maximum amount of permanent supportive housing that our city budget can fund, and we need to think about other solutions for folks who are unhoused?
Well, that goes back to my original point, which is the federal government needs to step up. I mean, where does it end? It ends when we reinvest in making sure that poor people in this country have a safe and decent place to live. We used to have that commitment. We actually had a law where you had a right in the United States to safe and decent housing. We took that away from folks, and after the Great Depression, we learned a lot of stuff, and we made a lot of mistakes. A lot of the housing that was created, but we know how to do it better now. And so it ends when when poor people in the United States have a safe and decent place to call home. We have to address the disparity between incomes and rent, or we'll continue to have large numbers of people experiencing homelessness. What's wrong with that? Beyond the suffering that entails for the individuals who are going through that, we're spending much more money keeping people homeless already. If we look at our numbers, in healthcare costs alone, we spend more money keeping people homeless. And so,
When you say keeping people homeless, what do you mean exactly?
by failed policy and refusing to invest in making sure that that people in the United States have a safe and decent place to call home. That's a non-choice is a choice. We're choosing not to act. Once we gutted and we cut federal housing by 78%. We continued to. That was like 4 decades ago. Every president. We continue to make that choice, and we're seeing it, and it's horrible for everyone. It's horrible for people who have to witness it. It's even worse for the people who are living it. And so those are choices that we're making. If you're homeless, and and Margot probably talked about this, but you're in all your different areas of medical after being homeless for a period of time, you're 25 years senior your calendar year. So myself as a 50-year-old woman, I'm 56, a 50-year-old woman, I present, but I'm horrible at math. I present as a 75-year-old woman, right? So, you know, diabetes, heart disease, responsiveness, all these different things, a lot of it is due to sleep deprivation. And so we really like we're literally killing people. And so this idea that folks are choosing to be homeless and it's like a free and easy lifestyle out there, it's not. It's really rough.
So I'm channeling the person that says, okay, yeah, it would be what should do. The federal government should step in and should make up from lost time and reinvest in housing for everyone and go back to where it was. But we can't rely on that. We don't know. I mean, Build Back Better apparently would have done a lot, but it didn't pass. The state of the Congress is such that it probably won't pass for another 2 years. Maybe it could in the next Congress, but it has been, as you said, 40 years since that gutting of the HUD budget, and nothing has changed, or at least not enough to actually make a dent in this issue. And so then we're faced with the reality of, again, the same question. Can we just keep building more and more permanent supportive housing, which with a budget that actually we're seeing a $700 million deficit over the next 2 years? And so the question really is like you got 8,000 folks in the city who are unhoused. Is there anything that can be done with some expediency within the budget constraints that we have?
Yeah, so the housing, I just want to kind of step back a little bit because you keep saying building permanent supportive housing. So when we talk about permanent supportive housing, there's a number of different elements to that. Permanent supportive housing also includes housing subsidies that you use in the private market that come with support services. Sometimes the subsidy comes from the federal government. We commonly refer to it Section 8. It's not called that anymore, but but we also have local versions of that. And so that we're having a pretty large amount of success. Starting to in San Francisco, had a tremendous amount of success in Los Angeles with this model. We have the construction, which is one piece of it. And I think the argument for construction is the same argument with, we want more housing, right? Because there's, this idea that there's a housing shortage, and so if we're paying to a private landlord, we're not necessarily expanding the pool. So that's another piece of the puzzle. And the acquisitions, as I mentioned, so that's another piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is using our public housing that we have really well, and we've been in kind of a situation for I guess it's like 6 years now, where Ed Lee, which was awesome that this happened, went through the process of rebuilding our public housing, which really needed to happen. So I'm not throwing shade on that at all. What that did, though, is that they ended up keeping all the vacancies and holding them, so that when they're tearing down one section of housing, they can move the people from that section to the vacants and then rebuild, and then it kind of just keeps going. So we're still on that mode, where we still are not filling our vacancies in public housing. So as soon as that ends, we need to make sure that those, and it'll be a lot of units, it'll be thousands of units, that those units are prioritized for unhoused people.
Wait, so just so I have this right, so there's a set amount of public housing units in the city. Mayor Lee got the money or the approvals to tear them down and build a lot more, like build towers? Is that what happened?
Well, they
Or
so
increase
it's
the number
four
of units?
big. Well, it was a fight to get one-for-one replacement. Let me just say that. So because what they wanted to do was do mixed income. And so in order to have one-for-one replacement at the income levels for the extremely low income people, so less than 30% of area median, basically we're talking about people earning $40,000, $30,000 a year and less, depending on the family size. So they had to, in order to do the mixed income, they had to and keep the same number of extremely low income units, they had to add units to it. So yeah, the big four housing developments in San Francisco have all been being rebuilt. And so Bayview, Alice Griffin, Potrero Hill.
Got it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about tents, encampments, and folks living on the street itself. And there's this lawsuit which folks didn't want to talk about last night because it's ongoing. But I think you're part of the lawsuit, right? Or
Yes, we are
leading
the
it?
ones.
You're
we
the
are
one
the
suing.
ones suing. Yes.
So you're suing the city, or who are you
Yes.
suing? You're suing the city.
Suing the city.
Why are you suing the city? What are you trying to accomplish with the lawsuit?
Yeah. So we are in settlement, so I can't talk about any of that. Um, but I can talk about the broad stuff. So why are we suing the city? So for years, what has been happening is that, well, let me just back it up a little bit to create some context. So when I mentioned the federal government backed out of providing housing for folks, basically what they did by doing that is they left this issue, created this issue, and then left it at the feet of municipal local governments, right? And what the local governments then did, because they didn't have the tax base to actually address it, is that they started using police primarily to move people and kind of manage public space. And that is not unique to San Francisco. That happens all across the country. And it has real consequences for folks. In San Francisco, people get between homeless people get between 10,000 and 20,000 citations a year. What typically happens around the country is, homeless people get citations, they can't pay them, they go to warrant, they get notices for court. They're not getting them in the mail because they don't have an address. They don't show up. They get warrants, and they basically spend a weekend in jail to be able to, pay off all those fines. And so it's kind of the modern version of a pauper's prison. So what happened is there was a court case in 2018 called Martins that basically made a constitutional claim that giving someone a ticket for lodging when they had nowhere to sleep was cruel and unusual punishment. And that was supported in an amicus brief by the Obama's Justice Department. That court case prevailed. And basically what it said is that you can't give people tickets if they don't have any place to live or a place to be, a shelter bed, or, et cetera. So in San Francisco, we've been for years witnessing the city try to move homeless people from place to place by using a couple of different methods. And one of their methods is property confiscation. And so they take people's property often out of their hands, they throw it in the dumpster. We did a survey pretty recently here in the Mission last year, just of homeless people in the Mission that the Latino Task Force did. 64% of people responded that they had been swept without being offered a place to live, a place to sleep first, right? That they have been forcibly removed without offering a place to stay. 75% had their personal items confiscated by the city. 44% had medications confiscated. Okay, so if you're on Medi-Cal and you're trying to replace your medications, okay, really difficult situation for folks. So we had been going to the city over and over again. We negotiated a policy around the property and how to handle it, and what they're supposed to do is bag and tag it and store it for 30 days, and people can go and pick it up. They said okay, but then they didn't do the policy, and we basically amounted like years of evidence, and we kept going to the city to try to get them to change, and they wouldn't. So we ended up finally being forced to sue. So we're basically doing 3 different constitutional challenges. We're doing the cruel and unusual punishment one based on Martins, but we're also doing some other challenges around the illegal property confiscation. What do we want out of it? What we want, call us crazy, is we want an effective street response that actually moves people into housing, into shelter, into treatment, into some place instead of block to block to block to block. We want them to stop taking people's property illegally. So that's why we're suing.
But are there places to bring people? I mean, I think we all would agree that it would be moving someone, spending all this time and money to move someone from 16th to 17th or 18th to 19th is not an ideal solution. But are there actual places to take the person who is living in a tent or on the street? Are there enough beds to move them to right now?
So that's part of the piece.
You keep hearing that there's like 1,000-person wait list for shelter beds, right? Like every night.
There's not, because they closed off the shelter. That we don't have. So we don't have any way for people to get shelter in San Francisco because they eliminated that. But before the pandemic, there was 1,000 people on the wait list for shelter. Now we don't know how many.
So if you
We
want a shelter,
obviously
where
would love to use part of this is part of the leverage of a lawsuit, right? So yes, my investment statement earlier. So invest more in expanding shelter, invest more in expanding housing, invest more in prevention, and use the lawsuit to force them to do that. They have vacant supportive housing units. They have about 1,000 of those units sitting there because of all the rigmarole and paperwork. Meanwhile, people are dying on the streets. Fill those units. I mean, like there's so many things that can happen. And so if we're not getting, this is just another kind of crowbar, so to speak, to kind of get the city to move. So, yeah. So in the situation where they're doing everything and we still don't have a place for everybody, for folks. I want to the city has done encampment resolutions right, and they've been effective. And I'll just bring up one model.
no, please, I'd love to hear what that looks like.
Yeah, so there was there's one that I'm going to mention. There's been other ones. This isn't the only one, but we always refer to it as the King Street model, and basically it was over by the Caltrans, kind of behind it. There was a large encampment of about 50 people who had been there that were pretty well established. I mean, they had a garden, et cetera, et cetera. One of the larger encampments in San Francisco since I've been around. They kept clearing them out. Then people would come back because it was a great little spot. It was really out of the way. Clear them out, come back, clear them out, come back, clear them out, come back. Put up a fence, cut the fence. I mean, it just, it was just like ongoing. Spent a whole bunch of money on all those clearances, just silly. So at that time, Bevan Dufty, who has been a supervisor, et cetera, and he was in homeless. We worked together collaboratively with him. Basically, the idea is to spend time with folks, do the assessments, figure out what they want, and then have a process to move people off the streets. And it does take time. Like, you've got to accumulate those resources, right? So what ended up happening in that situation is that brought in a container. People said they were really worried about their property and they wanted it protected. They're hanging on to that. It's the kind of thing that happens. People, it's the last things they have in life. Put it in a property in the container, and then people could keep what they wanted or get rid of what they wanted. People wanted to be housed together. They had formed a community. They wanted to be together. They ended up having 2 different buildings. People got to self-select which building they wanted to go in. Wasn't ready all at once. It was going to take time. Found an empty church. We got plenty of empty churches in San Francisco. Got the church. It was a black church. Everybody moved into the church and stayed there until the housing units opened up. And then people were able to self-select. One of our street sheet writers ended up getting this really bizarre cancer, and he ended up being able to have his best friend with him, who was his caretaker, until he passed away.
I think someone might say, after hearing that, like, that sounds great and amazing, but we can't do that for everyone, right? That a city of San Francisco or any city cannot possibly be able to accommodate in that way, with that level of specificity and desire, to anyone that wants it. And someone might say, well, I have to figure out a way to make a life for myself in this town, and I have to find a way to have a job and pay for my apartment, and why should other folks who can't afford it get congregant living and a box with all their stuff in it? And we can't accommodate everyone. We have to have rules. We have to have laws. You can't sleep on the street. And I'm sorry that you want to have your own unit and a place where you can access your things, but we can't do that for you. But you can't be here. So again, I'm channeling like what someone might say. So
well, that's been the idea, right? I mean, that has been our homeless policy. We enforce. We make it as uncomfortable as possible for people with the idea that they'd simply disappear. We have currently today 40% of our jail population is unhoused on petty stuff. So we're already doing that. That's not working. So what I'm saying is status quo sucks. Let's do something different. If we don't have enough resources for people, what are other things that we can do? for one thing, we can expand the investments, we can do it over a period of time, and we can build to it. It's not going to be an overnight thing. We got to make sure that there's bathrooms for folks. We got to make sure that there's good garbage service. A lot of times there's a lot of illegal dumping that's happening near folks. I mean, all of these things, and really making sure that if we're not able to house somebody today, we're working closely with them so that they have their immediate needs met, that there's not more harm done to them, keeping them as safe as we can, and then until that day when a unit opens up and they can move in.
Okay.
And that is sort of like there's not like a magic bullet that we can suddenly say, because we don't have control over the federal government, et cetera, that we can't just snap our fingers and say, all right, this is going to disappear. But enforcement doesn't work. We're already doing that. We have been doing it. It doesn't work.
So, a question about property and about space. So, and I will now take I'm channeling person hot and put my actual Manny Cutiel hat on. A situation that we had a week ago. There was a gentleman that we know in this neighborhood, in this community, and he had 5 shopping carts full of things tied up together on the corner, blocking the street all the way down in front of La Cumbre, and taking both sides of the street, so you had to walk in between. And I spoke to the man, and I said, it's a lot of things that's blocking the street, like, maybe we can figure out a better place for it. And he said, this is all my stuff. All of this is mine. No one can touch it. But it wasn't things to live in or medication. It was literally like broken microwaves and cardboard boxes and like shoes that I'm convinced this man was not wearing those shoes. They were stilettos. So like, I was like, well, you don't want to throw away someone's possessions, but for the person that might be walking down the street, you're like, well, some of these possessions don't seem like they're things to live with, but they're just taking up space. And so in that environment where someone is claiming ownership over things, the city came and they said, we cannot remove anything or even touch it because the gentleman is saying, these are my possessions. But in my perspective, I was like, I totally get that. I don't want to throw away your medication or even a tent that you're living in. But 5 shopping carts full of household items that you're not going to use, at what point, where do you draw the line of what is acceptable to hold on the street?
Well, I mean, I think, so probably I'm going to take a wild guess here and say that individual has a hoarding problem, which is a condition that there is medication available for. And so, trying to work with the person, and there's all kinds of strategies. That's one of the most difficult issues. It's difficult for folks in housing. A lot of people lose their housing because of hoarding. And it's pretty complicated. And I've been pretty close to some people that had really big issues with that, including like, there's a housed person who's a friend of mine, and he would not get rid of his urine or his, number 2. And it takes, basically he needed some intensive mental health work and to be able to get there.
I totally hear that. I guess what I'm
Yeah.
trying to ask is, with public space, with space that all of us have to use, and it's a delicate question. It's a question of like, where do we say in a society or in this city, how much public space can we allocate to folks who are suffering? And at what point do you say, like I heard in Berkeley, there's like a square footage that folks can use. There, if you're in a situation where you're sleeping on the street, there's an amount of space that you can take up. I think when folks drive by or walk by a tent encampment, the ones that I hear about are like where the tent takes up the entire sidewalk, where you cannot walk, and you have to walk into the street around it. And some folks see that and said, there's being compassionate, and then there's having no rules whatsoever.
Right. Well, so from a legal perspective, blocking the sidewalk is blocking the sidewalk. And so if you can't physically get past it, then you're violating that particular ordinance.
And what should happen in that case in a city?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like our lawsuit and all that stuff, it doesn't even touch that stuff like that. That there's nothing preventing the city from enforcing on those kinds of things.
But how do you do that? If there's a tent on the way here, I saw a tent that took over the entire sidewalk, and I saw people walk into the street around it.
Yeah.
Like, does the city say, excuse me, you can camp here, but just your tent has to be half the size? And they'll say, well, I don't have a tent half the size. And they say, well, like, what is the mechanism to obviously King Street would be the best, but in the short, and that's absent that, how should the city try to clear a sidewalk that is taken over?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, they can enforce on that and they can have those conversations. But typically, as a, for me, when I'm in conversations with folks, it's you usually can, um, it's these things in terms of how do we coexist in space and make it work for everybody. And I think really coming at things from a respectful perspective, and an understanding and a place of love and just treating each other like human beings and trying to problem solve. We have very little storage for folks, and it's it would be very convenient for folks to be able to have storage that they can access and come in and out of. The storage that the city does provide is very limited, or it has very limited hours, and you can only, bring certain things in and certain things out, and there's just like all this thing. So, I mean, I think that there's some kind of common sense ways to try to address a lot of these things, and then some things you're going to have these rare situations. They're going to take a lot more work, and it sometimes it's going to take more time and getting to know somebody and building trust and then trying to have those hard conversations. But that's more the exception. The typical situation is we can figure out how to coexist and issues can be addressed. A lot of times, like when people have large amounts of property and there's just like crap, you have a conversation with them like, I mean, I live in this neighborhood, and so I mean, what's up with all this stuff? And people be like, oh my God, somebody keeps dumping all their crap here. Can you help me? And I was like, yeah, I can do. I'm allowed to do one pickup a year, and so let me call and I'll figure it out. And they're like, thank you so much, and then and then we put it in the right spot and put the right notice on it, and the city comes and picks it up, and we get, I mean, there's solutions to this stuff that don't have to be, we're gonna tear the property from your hands and throw it in a crusher and,
Yeah.
threaten you with arrest. Like that
Yeah.
doesn't have to be the approach.
Yeah, I want to go back to enforcement, and then we're going to get to audience questions in about 5 minutes. And it's clear there are neighborhoods in San Francisco where there are that we won't see a lot of folks sleeping on the street in a tent or otherwise, and then there are areas of San Francisco where you'll see a lot of them, a lot of folks sleeping on the street in tents. And so when you make the claim like we do enforcement and it doesn't work, it seems like we do. There are areas where we enforce more or more strictly, or where if someone were to sleep on a tent on say Pacific Avenue, that tent would not last very long. But at 16th and Mission, or lots of other parts of San Francisco, there'll be a tent there, and no one seems to do anything, quote, do anything about it. And so, I guess I question a little bit whether or not we're doing enforcement right, because it seems like there's areas of San Francisco where we're not really doing a whole lot of enforcement at all.
Yeah. So it's important to understand homelessness in the context of poverty, and there is a percentage of people that are extremely poor in the United States that experience homelessness. It's typically between 7 and 9%. And so, and typically, folks are staying in the communities that they have an ante where they can use a shower, or they are able to stay this amount of time at their friend's place, or I mean, this is more the reason rather than enforcement of why you see in impoverished areas. You also have a much higher percentage of people of color. We have 5% of our city is African American, 40% of our homeless population, 50% of our homeless family population is African American. We had a 55% increase in Latino folks experiencing homelessness on this last pig count. A lot of that here in the Mission, folks who were essential workers, or lost work. That were restaurant workers that closed down, not essential workers, but restaurant workers who shut down, then became homeless. And so we had this. We have to remember it in that kind of context. What happens with enforcement, and this is an interesting thing because we had a theory, and so we did this big study with the guy from UC Berkeley, and we had a theory that there was sweeps that were going on in one area, and so in another area we were seeing an increase in unhoused people. And so we wanted to kind of dig into that and see what effect enforcement was having. And we were totally wrong. What we found is that people weren't moving more than a block away from where they were forced to leave. And so when we have the impression that enforcement isn't happening because people don't have anywhere to go and they come back and you know that like people have a sense of home. And as human beings, we're just like natural nesters, and people will stay in that area. And that's what's actually happening. And so I think that is more the issue than the enforcement piece. Um, and you know,
Okay.
yeah.
My last question is about we've talked a lot about the percentage of people who are San Franciscans that become homeless versus people who come here. And again, there's this perception that San Francisco is a people come here who are homeless or about to be homeless or became homeless somewhere else because of all the services we provide. There are people who say because of our more relaxed attitudes towards drug use. And if you have a drug problem, you think, well, I can do it in San Francisco and nothing's going to happen to me. And what's been mentioned is that about 30% of folks in the last 2022 point in time count indicated that they were not from San Francisco, and another 15 or so percent said that they had only moved to San Francisco within the last year, which is about 45% of folks. And so I don't actually think it matters if it's 40% or 20% or 60%. The fact that there are, and if you take that and there's 8,000 folks, that's 3,000, 3,500 people who, quote unquote, are not San Franciscans. They're not one of our own. They've come here, and they're homeless on our streets. And so I'm just channeling here. I'm just saying what people might be saying with it not on with the mic in front of everyone else. Why should we bend over backwards and put lockers and spend all this money and time and energy and tens of millions of dollars of money to help someone who's not a San Franciscan who is suffering? Why should we do it? Why shouldn't another city do it? Or why shouldn't we give? Why should they be allowed to be here? It's our street. It's affecting our quality of life.
So the allowed part, okay. So
Meaning,
the,
like, no,
but I
you can't
love
be
this
here.
question.
Yeah.
I love this question. All right.
And if
so,
you think I'm the only one that says that, then you are wrong, because a lot of
no,
people
no, no,
think
no.
that.
I know. I've done a couple speaking engagements before.
Not you. I know
So-
you know. I know you know. 'Cause
So I think, yeah. So, all right. So this is another thing we have to think about in a national perspective. So every city in the United States, Chicago, freezing cold winters. I haven't spent any time there, so I don't know, but I think it's pretty cold there. Um, Las Vegas, people coming there for the winter, right? And everything in between. Everybody thinks I used to be the director of the coalition in San Mateo County, and all 21 cities down there think they're a magnet. I swear to God. So, so everybody thinks that. Everybody thinks it. Okay, so what does the facts tell us? So there is a portion of people who are unhoused who move around. Why do they move around? They move around for the same migratory reasons as anyone else, for family and jobs, right? So we're in a city, so like every other city, we have a slightly larger number of people who come from outside than in like rural areas and suburban areas where people tend to, stay there. So it's a little bit in cities. You have a lot of folks. I bet not everybody here was born here in San Francisco. I'm going to take a guess. So with the homeless population, you have this percentage that in every municipality, it's the same thing. Las Vegas was, did the study. They found it wasn't true. People weren't coming there for the winter. Chicago, and all these places. So for the people who are coming, typically, they're not long-term homeless folks. They're not going to be able to get housing here because.
I think that's you.
Sorry, I thought I turned my phone off.
That's okay. This is a no shame space. You can take a second and
It's
turn it
okay.
off if you want.
I know who it is. It's my hubby because I recognize the ringtone.
Do you want to
It's okay,
pick it
he's
up? I
good.
don't want to. If you want to talk to him.
I can. So I think. So we know we don't have more people coming to San Francisco than in other municipalities. We have the same portion, right? And we also have our system set up where you have to demonstrate that you're homeless in San Francisco for a long period of time before you can qualify for housing. It's actually, at this point, it's about 15 years homeless before
So-
you could get housing.
Wait, you have to demonstrate that you've been homeless in San Francisco for 15 years
Yeah, through coordinated entry. Yeah,
to get housing.
to get housing.
Okay.
Yeah, through
Not-
through the homeless system.
Not that you had lived here in housing for 15 years. Okay.
Homeless, yeah. So it's pretty hard. So this idea that people are coming here for service, I mean that's so I think I also want to mention everywhere in the United States is having a major opioid crises. I mean, we are not unique in that. And I know Fox News likes to pretend like we are, but if you look at the overdoses, I mean, I don't care if you're like in the rural area of Tennessee or I mean, this is seriously like it's an issue. And I mean, opioids and and all the pill factory, I mean, all that stuff that happened, like this is a major, horrible thing that happened with our with our pharmaceutical companies and all the stuff that happened there. So, so the magnet theory has been disproven over and over again. I will say though, it is very convenient line for our policymakers to put out there. And every one of our policymakers, every one of our mayors, regardless of their stripes, has used this same trope because it lets themselves off the hook. We're doing everything possible, but everybody keeps coming in from outside, so we shouldn't do any more. And it totally lets them off the hook. And that has been said so often and so repeatedly in our media. It has literally permeated our consciousness. And the same thing happens in everywhere else. And so everyone is thinking this. And so it's one of those myths that's not that helpful. And I would say, regardless of that, every human being is deserving of dignity, and every human being is deserving of a safe place to call home. And I firmly believe that with all my heart.
All right, let's get to audience questions. The quick ask, because I know I went over and I'm sorry, is to try to keep your questions to a minute at least and have it actually be a question if you can. Let's go to the person with the striped sweater. Angelina's going to hold the mic in front of you. We'll try to get to as many
So many
questions
questions. This is so fun.
Hi,
get
could
in
you,
my
could you
excited
talk
mode.
about the benefits cliff? So that's when someone is getting subsidized housing and then they get a raise and then they no longer qualify for subsidized housing, but they aren't making enough to make up for that.
Okay, and actually pause if you don't mind, Jennifer. We're gonna do round robin in the beginning because I bet there's a bunch of questions. So, okay, since you're there, let's go to Eric right here.
Oh, like a bunch of questions. And
We're
then
gonna do
keep track
three.
of
We're just
them?
gonna do
Can you
three.
talk about what
and
you
can we
would
get a
like to
pen for
see?
Jennifer as well?
I did
Do you
have
have
a
a pen?
Who has a pen handy?
Anyone got a pen? Oh, we got a pen.
Oh,
Awesome.
thank you.
Okay,
I have
this
one.
way we can just get through more questions and the answers can be a little bit.
What models with market rate or market rate-ish housing development would you like to see in San Francisco to address the prices of rent?
What's your thoughts on market rate housing? What amount of market rate housing? Let's go to Bob the builder here, Bob the Castro handyman.
My friend John lives in a sanctioned homeless encampment at Shotwell and Cesar Chavez. It's very well run, very well organized. There are 30 well-behaved people there. In the industrial section of San Francisco, there are empty warehouses that could be leased by the city. They could get tents off the streets into these warehouses as sanctioned homeless tent communities.
Okay, so benefits cliff, market rate housing, and sanctioned encampment sites in the warehouses in the industrial part of the city.
Yeah, on the benefits cliff, that is, it affects like in a myriad of different ways. So it affects when people have welfare and they basically get their grant reduced when they're working, so it's almost a punishment for working. And then there's other benefits that are attached to that, like childcare. And so it does create like this huge problem when folks, like you work, you have your you have your childcare, and then you basically lose everything once your income gets too high. And so there has been some policy changes that have addressed that, where there's more bridge time, and they've increased income levels in different programs. But I do agree with you that that continues to be an issue for sure, and could be pretty easily remedied through policy changes in these variety of things. What amount of market rate housing would bring down the rents? I don't think any amount of market rate housing could be produced in San Francisco that would make the rents low enough for someone who is so impoverished to afford rents. And so I think the disparity between incomes and rent is just too big. And so the only way we can get the rents down really for unhoused people is to do subsidies. And we could subsidize the private market developments that have BMR requirements. The below market rate, they have to have a certain number of units that are below market rate, but they're not affordable to homeless people. And so we have to supplement that with an additional subsidy, and that has to count as their income in order to qualify. And there's some work being done there, but there's more we could do. And then warehouses, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And you could put tiny homes in there, you could do all kinds of stuff, right? Yeah.
All
Out of the weather.
Exactly.
right here in the front. We'll do 3 again.
A lot of things that we talked about is kind of like, oh, it's like institutional or structural issues that are trying to get fixed by like government officials or organizations. Like, are there things that you think individuals should do, or like, what would you ideally be like, oh, if we had a lot of people like vote a certain way or write certain people, or like what on an like, I've learned a lot about institutionally what we could do. Kind of what do you think we should be doing as individuals?
Great question. Awesome. Let's go another front question right here, and then we'll move around to this side.
Yeah, I know you mentioned moving people into permanent housing, is a good approach. But what do you think the city should do to get people out of there and self-sustainable so that they're kind of, rotating out, right?
These are great questions. Great, and let's get one more over here, right over there in the corner, and then we're gonna get the rest of this side. So with the dark hair, the brunette, yeah.
Hi, I was wondering, I think with one of the pandemic bills, there was a tax credit, a child tax credit that went through for low-income people, and I was wondering what you thought the impact that was on homelessness.
Got it. What can individuals do? How to move people through the PSH pipeline, and then the child tax credit, and what's going on with that?
Yeah. What can individuals do? Yeah, so much. I mean, I think, get to know your unhoused neighbors. Get to know what services are in your neighborhood so you can be helpful. There's a lot of things that people can do individually for folks. And there's folks in this room that do that, that do a lot of that work. Yeah. And I think just, you could do GoFundMe's there's just so much stuff you can do individually, but it has to be driven by the unhoused person themselves in terms of them identifying what support they need. In terms of, volunteering, absolutely getting to know, there's a lot of neighborhood groups that tend to really focus on an enforcement approach. And I think going to those meetings and really trying to get people to think outside of enforcement and thinking about real solutions is really important. Educate yourself. Street sheet's a great way to get educated. So read the street sheet and then really engage in the dialogue when you hear all those misnomers that are out there. And, in terms of, when things are coming up on the ballot, we have more anti-homeless laws in San Francisco than any other city in the state, and the state has more anti-homeless laws than anywhere in the country. We have used homeless people as a wedge. Everyone has to make sure that our policymakers are not doing that anymore. We can't, get downtown interests into place on the backs of homeless people by passing a law that says 6 months in jail for sitting on a sidewalk, or 6 months in jail for panhandling, or 6 months in jail for tent ban, which we have. So, basically the whole existence has already been illegal of unhoused people. So really pushing back against those when they're coming up, and as they will again and again.
All right, we had
Out of permanent
Yeah,
supportive
yep.
housing. So, sorry, I spent more time on that because I felt like it was a really important
no.
question.
I'm seeing not heads shaking. Yes, it's good. Thank you for doing that.
Permanent supportive housing. So another area, and I mentioned prevention, another area where we really fall short in San Francisco is the jobs piece. And we really don't invest in workforce among Black and brown community members that have been disenfranchised, that didn't have educational opportunities. We need to do it in a way that really seriously gives people the opportunity to lift up. You know, we used to, pre-Clinton, I had many friends that got through college on welfare. You can't do that anymore. It's literally illegal on welfare. I mean, it's like you get cut off of welfare. You don't have a chance. You know, they used to pay for your books. They used to do all this stuff. So we need to really do those investments. So while people are in housing and they have that break on the rent, they have the opportunity to be able to increase their job skills and really be able to increase their income and be able to move out. And it's a missed opportunity. Not everyone's going to be able to do it. A lot of our folks are really elderly. They have a lot of disabilities. But for a good chunk of the population that's unhoused, absolutely that can happen. And I want to say, as we're building up our homeless system, it's a great way to create jobs for folks. And so we can do both at the same time. And that's a really beautiful thing. So when we're operating housing and we're hiring unhoused people and we're making sure those wages are decent so that they can then afford rent on their own.
All right.
Yeah.
Earned income tax credit, and then we're going to get 3 more here, and then I think, unfortunately, we do
Yes,
need to
I-
call
the-
her.
The child tax care credit, the yeah, those are all great. That's a great, that is a great intervention that is very effective and really does help. And we're trying to do one in San Francisco to add to it. Yeah.
Don't worry, H, you're going to be my final question. Kate.
I think there was an audible reaction to when you said that somebody has to be homeless for 15 years before accessing housing. Could you be specific about what they can't or what they need 15 years of homelessness to access? Is it services? Is it housing? What was it?
Yeah.
But don't answer it quite yet, if you don't mind. I'm sorry. In the back. I just want to be able to move through people as much as I can.
I
'cause-
forgot for a second.
No, it's okay. With the hair, yeah. The good hair. Not that you don't have. Wait, you. Oh, I didn't. Okay, let's do both. I didn't see your hand.
Oh my gosh.
With coordinated entry, the city defines a homeless family very narrowly, but SFUSD has a very expansive view of what a homeless family is. Can you talk a little bit about homeless families and how the city is serving them? Also, sorry, was Care Not Cash a good idea?
Okay, that was a two-parter. And the other person with the great hair that I did not see and in front of you, I'm so sorry.
This might be a layman's question. So when you do see someone who's homeless and needs help, like who should you be calling? Because I was not aware of these street teams. And so is there a specific number? Like what are the kind of the resources available? Number 2, there seem to be a lot of groups that can build permanent housing and give homeless people work as part of doing that. What is even the process of doing something like that? And like who manages the budget?
Okay.
Some basics. Yeah.
And I'm sorry if I offended you. I really didn't see your hand, and I'll stop using. He has like actor hair. Okay.
All right.
Go
So,
ahead.
all right. So the 15-year piece. So the way to get into housing in San Francisco currently, and this is going to change because it's a really bad system, is called coordinated entry. And they basically do an assessment and they give you a certain amount of points, and you get points for length of homelessness, and they verify your length of homelessness as being homeless in San Francisco, and that's how you get counted. So you show up in the homeless system for being in shelter, et cetera, et cetera. So the longer homelessness gets the priority, which makes sense on some level. As Prop C dollars are rolling out, that will hopefully shorten and shorten and shorten. And we're getting the system changed to be more about assessing need and not about this kind of like, yeah, it's just, it's basically you qualify for housing if, instead, we basically want everyone to qualify for housing, and we're changing it that way. Coordinated entry, okay, so the definition of family in San Francisco, we at the Coalition on Homelessness, and the official definition of homelessness in San Francisco, it matches the education definition that includes families that are living in residential hotels and with minor children, and families who are with minor children that are doubled up. And in an attempt to say that they were ending family homelessness, San Francisco shrunk down the eligibility, very, very strict. This has had a terrible impact on families, and especially mothers who are in domestic violence situations and the shelters are full and they can't leave, and people being in really bad, very bad situations that no longer qualify. So we're also working on that expansion so that anyone who we can get to a place. We may not be able to solve within San Francisco dollars homelessness for everybody, but we can solve for our families with kids. And that, if we don't do that, we're also driving up homelessness in the future, because that is a number one indicator of who ends up being homeless as an adult. And so we absolutely have to do that. And so that's that piece, and that includes families in hotels who don't have bathrooms and are in really poor conditions, whose children don't meet developmental milestones and have huge educational delays because of their housing being so crappy. So that's why we include that broader definition. It's actually coming from a health perspective. Care Not Cash, no, they could have done it right. It's so complicated, but if you, it cuts welfare by 80%, and then for people who are on that form of welfare, which you can't be a veteran, you can't have unemployment, you can't be disabled, like any other form of benefits, you qualify for this form of benefit, and then a lot of our housing is narrow just for that population. And it's paid for by the reductions in welfare, and they could have easily done it differently and just invested in housing and done it in a way that didn't have the harmful side effects. For people who are on that form of assistance, for a lot of folks, it's great because they have been able to get housing. It's just a bizarre way to organize our system. And so it just puts people with disabilities at a disadvantage. There's no other way to say it.
And then the question is about what should you do if someone is in distress or homeless in the street? Who do you call? And the question about building folks who are unhoused, building the housing for themselves.
Yeah, the who to call. We've been trying to create a situation where there is a place to call citywide. We haven't quite gotten there. They do have the SCIRT teams available through 911 for folks in psychiatric crises, although you can't guarantee that a police officer, it has to fit the narrow definition. So if there's any safety issue, they're going to send a cop. But if it is someone in psychiatric crises that there's no safety issue, you can call 911 and they will send the SCIRT team, and they are responding to 100% of those calls. And so that's that piece. I mentioned get to know the services in your area, because it is once you there might, if someone needs a shower, you want to know where the showers are nearby. It really depends on what the person is asking for. There isn't, though, just like a central number at all. The next question was the build housing. The process there is, and we did this when we created what was called Community Housing Partnership and is now called HomeRise. We basically worked with the unions to get unhoused people union cards. And then once they got union cards, they were able to work on the building and do the rehab. And so that's basically the process in San Francisco. It's a union town. And so you want to go through the unions because all the public building is all going to be union shop.
All right, let's try, Precious, to get one more round. We're going to go to you, then to you in the back. You had your hand raised, right? No. Okay. We're going to get to you up front. Oh, sorry, Kara. Okay, right here. Yes. Stephanie, sorry.
I was so confused. So,
But quick questions, quick answers, because I want to let everyone out.
what struck me was the amount of criminalization for the homeless. So, what should be illegal on the street?
Okay.
So should having a tent be illegal or things like that?
Okay, should having a tenant be illegal on the street? Go ahead.
Is there any particular opportunities or problems that face people who are housed in their vehicles?
Are there any problems with
Any
people?
particular issues faced by people living in their vehicles, or are there any particular solutions?
Problems and solutions for folks living in their vehicles. And then H, I promised you, and I'm going to give you the last question.
Where are you?
He's all the way in the corner by the lamp. Yeah, give it right now. Now's the time.
Hold on.
Every street in this city, every sidewalk in a month, if you did two things. First, the mayor's got to agree to let the people go to Treasure Island. Treasure Island, the contract that the city signed when we took that land in 1997, the first use to alleviate poverty. Right now, they've got a couple of things. It's got 900 acres. It's 2/3 the size of Presidio, and it's vacant. You could clear every tent off of every sidewalk in San Francisco, and the second thing you gotta do, the way you do it, is you enforce the sit-lie law. You give it, you can't move them unless you got a place to go. Treasure Island, the federal government told San Francisco when they gave us that island, first use it for your poor.
All right.
Designing condos there, and you know what? The plans they made for it, that it's gonna.
H.
It's gonna be flooded in 20 years. It is sinking at the same rate as the sea is rising.
All right.
There's gonna be no development there. It's a great place to pitch a tent, because you don't have to go to bedrock with the tent stake.
All right, thank you. H, so the third question, I believe, is the viability of using Treasure Island as a mechanism to house folks. Those are the three questions, Jennifer.
Okay, so, I mean, for me on the illegal thing, and you know, there's a whole question around criminal justice and what, you know, what's an effective way to address things. So kind of putting it within that context, for me, the litmus test really is around safety. And it's not, you know, is there a safety issue? Is there not, right? The vehicularly housed folks, so a lot of problems with access to showers and bathrooms, or if it's RVs, black water dumping, sanitation, garbage, all of that kind of stuff. Solutions, certainly safe parking is a great solution. And we have one program right now. It's been really, really hard to get a site. And the city, I will say, has been working pretty hard to try to get a site. There is, you know, I mean, there's a lot of politics around this stuff, and we haven't talked about that, but there's a lot of resistance to programs going into neighborhoods. And so that's another way, going back to your thing about people really turning out for those things and trying to be supportive when those are being placed. And I think there is a lot of examples around the country around like places where people can park where they're self-managed and don't have to cost that much, and but you do want to have access to the showers and the water. Electricity is really important, and bathrooms, of course, and garbage service. So those are big things there. Treasure Island, there is some housing out there right now for homeless folks.
H, let her answer the question.
You empty the sidewalks and move your people there. There's plenty of room.
So there is some challenges around transportation, access.
H, let her answer the question.
Yeah. So, if there is an opportunity for folks, I mean, all of this is around self-determination. So if there was.
All right, H, I'm going to close it down if you keep interrupting her. Okay. Okay, H. Go ahead. You can finish the answer to the question.
Just there is housing there for formerly homeless people. There is a lot of concern around the people who are living there, around the.
Well, don't be mean to him on his way out, but he has the right to leave too if he wants to.
Just a lot of. We get a lot of feedback from the residents there that are formerly unhoused around a lot of health issues and things that are happening, and a lot of concern around how safe that area really is. And so I know that there's been quite a bit of attention on that. I don't know enough about what it would take to clean it up, et cetera.
The hubby wants to talk. Let's give a round of applause to Jennifer Friedenbach from the Coalition on Homelessness. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
I wanna just thank you. You devote your time to this issue, and you devote it with so much grace and responsibility. And so I want to thank you for giving us time tonight. for giving us your time, where you could have been doing something else or out there helping someone, and you decided to come here and answer these questions. So thank you for your time. Folks, it's been 4 nights consecutively where we've been talking about this issue. And I just want to say I want to thank you all also for giving us your time and your evenings. And in many cases, you've brought out notebooks, you've been taking notes, you've been learning. And my hope with this series was that by the end of it, you could really feel informed. That you may not know the answers to all the questions, but you can talk to people about what you've heard and what some of the answers have been. Things like, what causes this? What are the demographics of our homeless population? When did this start? What have mayors tried to do? When is the issue? How has the issue ebbed and flowed? What are the different solutions that have been proposed? You could talk about what the city's currently doing, what the budget of our homelessness services are, what the city's trying to do to address crisis on the street, what we're doing from a regional perspective. And tonight you heard a conversation about what should be done. What is the radical imagination on this issue? What are the changes that one individual who is a leader in this work would want to see changed? Of course, we did not cover all of the bases here. I think, at least from my own self-reflection, if I could have done 2 more nights or changed in any way, I would have definitely spent an evening speaking directly with service providers who are working with the community in SROs, doing direct services. And 2, the glaring kind of absence here is we didn't have perspectives from folks in particular who are experiencing homelessness or are formerly homeless, talking about what their experience is like. We have done those programs at Manny's before, but for this, we had 4 nights. I would have definitely had an evening where we spoke with folks who are either experiencing or formerly homeless. So we're going to send you a little survey. Precious is going to send you a survey with what other ways we could have done this better. And also, if there's another issue that you think we should spend an entire week focusing on. But I want to just quickly plug 2 upcoming events. One is on Wednesday night. The new president of the Human Rights Campaign, the largest LGBT rights group in the country, is coming here on Wednesday night. It's going to be a really amazing conversation. And then on Friday night, we're doing a fundraiser for the victims of the earthquake in Syria and Turkey from 6 to 8 p.m. So please mark your calendars for that. Thank you so much for supporting Manny's, for being here this evening on a Friday evening to learn about this issue, for wanting to be informed citizens, for wanting to be part of the solution, for wanting to find compassionate, effective solutions for the folks who are suffering in our city, for wanting to represent the best of this country, how we can be an example, a leader in how to solve this issue, which has not been around forever. If there's one takeaway from this, if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this, was this issue has had a beginning in this city. And so it can have an end, right? It is not intractable. There are ideas, and we just need to, as a community, as a civil society, think about what we do to achieve those. And so my final ask of you is that in your conversations with folks, use what you've learned, ask good questions, and try to be a part of the solution. Thank you, Angelina Polselli, for running our events over the last 4 nights. Thank you, Precious Green, as well, for being our Director of Programming. And thank you to Ashley Kozak in the front, who served you drinks tonight and served you beer and wine and anything else that you got. You can exit through the back door unless you're staying for our 7 o'clock event, which is a story time on the subject of home. And some folks will be sharing their own stories of what home means to them. So if you'd like to stay for that, you can stay or stick around here. If not, have a wonderful weekend. And